Continuing Crassus, from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. They began to suspect some treachery, and at the same time came messengers from Artavasdes that he was fiercely attacked by Herodes, who had invaded his country, so that now it was impossible for him to send any succors, and that he therefore advised Crassus to turn back, and with joint forces to give Herodes battle, or at least that he should march and encamp where horses could not easily come, and keep to the mountains. Crassus, out of anger and perverseness, wrote him no answer, but told them at present he was not at leisure to mind the Armenians, but he would call upon them another time and revenge himself upon Artavasdes for his treachery. Cassius and his friends began again to complain, but when they perceived that it merely displeased Crassus, they gave over, but privately railed at the barbarian. What evil genius, O thou worst of men, brought thee to our camp? And with what charms and potions hast thou bewitched Crassus, that he should march his army through a vast and deep desert, through ways which are rather fit for a captain of Arabian robbers than for the general of a Roman army? But the barbarian, being a wily fellow, very submissively exhorted them, and encouraged them to sustain it a little further, and ran about the camp, and professing to cheer up the soldiers, asked them jokingly, "What do you think you march through Campania, expecting everywhere to find springs and shady trees and baths and inns of entertainment? Consider you now travel through the confines of Arabia and Assyria." Thus he managed them like children, and before the cheat was discovered, he rode away. Not but that Crassus was aware of his going, but he had persuaded him that he would go and contrive how to disorder the affairs of the enemy. It is related that Crassus came abroad that day, not in his scarlet robe, which Roman generals usually wear, but in a black one, which, as soon as he perceived, he changed. And the standard-bearers had much ado to take up their eagles, which seemed to be fixed to the place. Crassus laughed at it, and hastened their march, and compelled his infantry to keep pace with his cavalry, till some few of the scouts returned and told them that their fellows were slain, and that they hardly escaped, that the enemy was at hand in full force, and resolved to give them battle. On this all was in an uproar. Crassus was struck with amazement, and for haste could scarcely put his army in good order. First, as Cassius advised, he opened the ranks and files, that they might take up as much space as could be, to prevent their being surrounded, and distributed the horse among the wings. But afterwards, changing his mind, he drew up his army in a square, and made a front every way, each of which consisted of 12 cohorts, to every one of which he allotted a troop of horse, that no part might be destitute of the assistance that the horse might give, and that they might be ready to assist everywhere, as need should require. Cassius commanded one of the wings, young Crassus the other, and he himself was in the middle. Thus they marched on till they came to a little river named Belisus, a very inconsiderable one in itself, but very grateful to the soldiers, who had suffered so much by drought and heat all along their march. Most of the commanders were of the opinion that they ought to remain there that night, and to inform themselves as much as possible of the number of the enemies and their order, and so march against them at the break of day, But Crassus was so carried away by the eagerness of his son and the horsemen that were with him, who desired and urged him to lead them on and engage, that he commanded those that had a mind to it to eat and drink as they stood in their ranks, and before they had all well done, he led them on, not leisurely and with halts to take breath, as if he was going to battle, but kept on his pace as if he had been in haste, till they saw the enemy, contrary to their expectation, neither so many nor so magnificently armed as the Romans expected. For Surenna had hid his main force behind the first ranks, and ordered them to hide the glittering of their armor with coats and skins. But when they approached, and the general gave the signal, immediately all the field rung with a hideous noise and terrible clamor. For the Parthians do not encourage themselves to war with cornets and trumpets, but with a kind of kettle drum, which they strike all at once in various quarters. With these they make a dead hollow noise, like the bellowing of beasts, mixed with sounds resembling thunder, having, it would seem, very correctly observed, that all of our senses hearing most confounds and disorders us, and that the feelings excited through it most quickly disturb and most entirely overpower the understanding. When they had sufficiently terrified the Romans with their noise, they threw off the covering of their armor, and shone like lightning in their breastplates and helmets of polished Margianian steel, and with their horses covered with brass and steel trappings. Surenna was the tallest and finest looking man himself, but the delicacy of his looks and effeminacy of his dress did not promise so much manhood as he really was master of, for his face was painted, and his hair parted after the fashion of Metis, whereas the other Parthians made a more terrible appearance with their shaggy hair gathered in a mass upon their foreheads after the Scythian mode. Their first design was with their lances to beat down and force back the first ranks of the Romans. But when they perceived the depth of their battle and the soldiers firmly kept their ground, they made a retreat, and, pretending to break their order and disperse, they encompassed the Roman square before they were aware of it. Crassus commanded his light-armed soldiers to charge. But they had not gone far before they were received with such a shower of arrows that they were glad to retire amongst the heavy armed, with whom this was the first occasion of disorder and terror, when they perceived the strength and force of their darts, which pierced their arms and passed through every kind of covering, hard and soft alike. The Parthians, now placing themselves at distances, began to shoot from all sides, not aiming at any particular mark, for indeed the order of the Romans was so close that they could not miss if they would, but simply sent their arrows with great force of strong bent bows, the strokes from which came with extreme violence. The position of the Romans was a very bad one from the first, for if they kept their ranks, they were wounded, and if they tried to charge, they hurt the enemy none the more, and themselves suffered none the less. For the Parthians threw their darts as they fled, an art in which none but the Scythians excel them, and it is indeed a cunning practice, for while they thus fight to make their escape, they avoid the dishonor of a flight. However, the Romans had some comfort to think, when they had spent all their arrows, they would either give over or come to blows. But when they presently understood that there were numerous camels loaded with arrows, and that when the first ranks had discharged those they had, they wheeled off and took more. Crassus, seeing no end of it, was out of all heart, and sent to his son that he should endeavor to fall in upon them before he was quite surrounded. For the enemy advanced most upon that quarter, and seemed to be trying to ride around and come up upon the rear. Therefore, the young man, taking with him 1,300 horse, 1,000 of which he had from Khazar, 500 archers, and 8 cohorts of fully armed soldiers that stood next him, led them up with design to charge the Parthians. whether it was that they found themselves in a piece of marshy ground, as some think, or else designing to entice young Crassus as far as they could from his father, they turned and began to fly. Whereupon he, crying out that they durst not stand, persuaded them, and with Censorinus and Megabacchus, both famous, the latter for his courage and prowess, the other for being of a senator's family, and an excellent orator, both intimates of Crassus, and of about the same age. The horse thus pushing on, the infantry stayed a little behind, being exalted with hopes and joy, for they supposed that they had already conquered, and now were only pursuing, till when they were gone too far, they perceived the deceit, for they that seemed to fly now turned again, and a great many fresh ones came on. Upon this they made a halt, for they doubled not, but now the enemy would attack them, because they were so few. But they merely placed their cuirassiers to face the Romans, and with the rest of their horse rode about, scouring the field, and thus stirring up the sand. They raised such a dust that the Romans could neither see nor speak to one another, and being driven in upon one another in one close body, they were thus hit and killed, dying not by a quick and easy death, but with miserable pains and convulsions. For writhing upon the darts in their bodies, they broke them in their wounds, and when they would by force pluck out the barbed points, they caught the nerves and veins, so that they tore and tortured themselves. Many of them died thus, and those that survived were disabled for any service. And when Publius exhorted them to charge the cuirassiers, they showed him their hands nailed to their shields, and their feet stuck to the ground, so that they could neither fly nor fight. He charged him in himself boldly, however, with his horse, and came to close quarters with them, but was very unequal, whether as to the offensive or defensive part. For with his weak and little javelins he struck against targets that were of tough raw hides and iron, whereas the lightly clad bodies of his Gaulish horsemen were exposed to the strong spears of the enemy. For upon these he mostly depended, and with them he wrought wonders, for they would catch hold of the great spears, and close upon the enemy, so pull them off from their horses, where they could scarce stir by reason the heaviness of their armor. And many of the Gauls, quitting their own horses, would creep under those of the enemy, and stick them in the belly, which, growing unruly with pain, trampled upon their riders, and upon the enemies promiscuously. The Gauls were chiefly tormented by the heat and drought, being not accustomed to either, and most of their horses were slain by being spurred on against the spears, so that they were forced to retire among the foot, bearing off Publius, grievously wounded. Observing a sandy hillock not far off, they made to it, and tying their horses to one another, and placing them in the midst, and joining all their shields together before them, they thought they might make some defense against the barbarians, but it fell out quite contrary. For when they were drawn up in a plain, the front in some measure secured those that were behind, but when they were upon the hill, one being of necessity higher up than another, none were in shelter, but all alike stood equally exposed, bewailing their inglorious and useless fate. There were with Publius 2 Greeks that lived there at Carha, Hieronymus and Nicomachus. These men urged him to retire with them and fly to Icna, a town not far from thence, and friendly to the Romans. No, said he, There is no death so terrible for the fear which the Publius would leave his friends that die upon his account, and bidding them to take care of themselves, he embraced them and sent them away, and because he could not use his arm, for he was run through with a dart, he opened his side to his armor-bearer, and commanded him to run him through. It is said, Censorinus fell in the same manner. Megabaccus slew himself, as did also the rest of the best note. The Parthians, well, it depends on what you mean by best, right? The Parthians coming upon the rest with their lances, killed them fighting, nor were they above 500 taken prisoners. Cutting off the head of Publius, they rode off directly towards Crassus. His condition was thus: when he had commanded his son to fall upon the enemy, and word was brought him that he fled, and that there was a distant pursuit, and perceiving also that the enemy did not press upon him so hard as formerly, for they were mostly gone to fall upon Publius, he began to take heart a little, and drawing his army towards some sloping ground, expected when his son would return from the pursuit of the messengers whom Publius sent to him. As soon as they saw his danger, the first were intercepted by the enemy and slain. The last, hardly escaping, came and declared that Publius was lost unless he had speedy succors. Crassus was terribly distracted, not knowing what counsel to take, and indeed no longer capable of taking any, overpowered now by fear for the whole army, now by desire to help his son. At last he resolved to move with his forces. Just upon this, up came the enemy with their shouts and noises more terrible than before, their drums sounding again in the ears of the Romans, who now feared a fresh engagement, and they who brought Publius's head upon the point of a spear, riding up near enough that it could be known, scoffingly inquired where his parents and what family he was of, for it was impossible that so brave and gallant a warrior should be the son of so pitiful a coward as Crassus. This sight, above all the rest, dismayed the Romans, for it did not incite them to anger as it might have done, but to horror and trembling. Though they say Crassus outdid himself in this calamity, for he passed through the ranks and cried out to them, "This, O my countrymen, is my own peculiar loss, but the fortune and the glory of Rome is safe and untainted so long as you are safe. But if anyone be concerned for my loss of the best of sons, let him show it in revenging himself upon the enemy. Take away their joy, revenge their cruelty, nor be dismayed at what is past. For whoever tries for great objects most suffer something. Neither did Lucullus overthrow Tigranes without bloodshed, nor Scipio Antiochus. Our ancestors lost in 1,000 ships about Sicily, and how many generals and captains in Italy, no one of which losses hindered them from overthrowing their conquerors. For the state of Rome did not arrive to this height by fortune, but by perverseness and virtue in confronting danger. While Crassus thus spoke, exhorting them, he saw but few that gave much heed to him, and when he ordered them to shout for battle, he could no longer mistake the despondency of his army, which made but a faint and unsteady noise, while the shout of the enemy was clear and bold. And when they came to the business, the Parthian servants and dependents, riding about, shot their arrows, and the horsemen in the foremost ranks with their spears drove the Romans close together, except those that rushed upon them for fear of being killed by their arrows. Neither did those do much execution, being quickly dispatched, for the strong, thick spear made large and mortal wounds, and often run through 2 men at once, and they were thus fighting. The night coming on parted them, and the Parthians, boasting that they would indulge Crassus with 1 night to mourn his son, unless upon better consideration he would rather go to Arsacus than be carried to him. These, therefore, took up their quarters near them, being flushed with their victory. But the Romans had a sad night of it, for neither taking care for the burial of their dead, nor the cure of the wounded, nor the groans of the expiring, every one bewailed his own fate, for there was no means of escaping, whether they should stay for the light, or venture to retreat into the vast desert in the dark. And now the wounded men gave them new trouble, since to take them with them would retard their flight, and if they should leave them, they might serve as guides to the enemy by their cries. However, they were all desirous to see and hear Crassus, though they were sensible that he was the cause of all their mischief. But he wrapped his cloak around him and hid himself, where he lay, as an example to ordinary minds of the caprice of fortune, but to the wise of inconsiderateness and ambition, who, not content to be superior to so many millions of men, being inferior to two, esteemed himself as the lowest of all. Then came Octavius, his lieutenant, and Cassius to comfort him. But he being altogether past helping, they themselves called together the centurions and tribunes, and agreeing that the best way was to fly, they ordered the army out without sound of trumpet, and at first with silence. But before long, when the disabled men found they were left behind, strange confusion and disorder, with an outcry and lamentation, seized the camp, and a trembling and dread presently fell upon them, as if the enemy were at their heels. By which means, now and then turning out of their way, now and then standing to their ranks, sometimes taking up the wounded that followed, sometimes laying them down, they wasted the time, except 300 horse, whom Agnatius brought safe to Carha about midnight, were calling in the Roman tongue to the watch. As soon as they heard him, he bade them tell Coponius, the governor, that Crassus had fought a very great battle with the Parthians, and having said but this, not so much as telling his name, he rode away at full speed to Zeugma, and by this means he saved himself and his men, but lost his reputation by deserting the general. However, his message to Coponius was for the advantage of Crassus, for he, suspecting by this hasty and confused delivery of the message that all was not well, immediately ordered the garrison to be in arms, and as soon as he understood that Crassus was upon the way towards him, he went out to meet him, and received him with his army into the town. The Parthians, although they perceived their dislodgment in the night, yet did not pursue them, but as soon as it was day they came upon those that were left in the camp, and put no less than 4,000 to the sword, and with their light horse picked up a great many stragglers. Varguntinus, the lieutenant, while it was yet dark, had broken off from the main body with 4 cohorts, which had strayed out of the way, and the Parthians, encompassing these on a small hill, slew every man of them excepting 20, who with their drawn swords forced their way through the thickest, and they, admiring their courage, opened their ranks to the right and left, and let them pass without molestation to Carha. Soon after, a false report was brought to Surenna that Crassus with his principal officers had escaped, and that those who were got into Carha were but a confused rout of insignificant people, not worth further pursuit. Supposing, therefore, that he had lost the very crown and glory of his victory, and yet being uncertain whether it were so or not, and anxious to ascertain the fact, that he so should either stay and besiege Carha or follow Crassus, he sent one of his interpreters to the walls, commanding him in Latin to call for Crassus or Cassius. For that the general Surenna desired a conference. As soon as Crassus heard this, he embraced the proposal, and soon after there came up a band of Arabians, who very well knew the faces of Crassus and Cassius, having been frequently in the Roman camp before the battle. They, having espied Cassius from the wall, told him that Surenna desired a peace, and would give them safe convoy if they would make a treaty with the king his master, and withdraw all their troops out of Mesopotamia. And this he thought most advisable for them both. Before things came to the last extremity, Cassius, embracing the proposal, desired that a time and place might be appointed where Crassus and Surenna might have an interview. The Arabians, having charged themselves with the message, went back to Surenna, who was not a little rejoiced that Crassus was there to be besieged. Next day, therefore, he came up with his army, insulting over the Romans, and haughtily demanded of them Crassus and Cassius, bound, if they expected any mercy. The Romans, seeing themselves deluded and mocked, were much troubled at it, but advising Crassus to lay aside his distant and empty hopes of aid from the Armenians, resolved to fly for it, and this design ought to have been kept private, for they were upon their way, and not have been told to any of the people of Carha, but Crassus let this also be known to Andromachus, the most faithless of men. Nay, he was so infatuated as to choose him for his guide. The Parthians then, to be sure, had a punctual intelligence of all that passed, but it being contrary to their usage, and also difficult for them to fight by night, and Crassus having chosen that time to set out, Andromachus, lest he should get the start too far of his pursuers, led him hither and thither, and at last conveyed him into the midst of the morasses and the places full of ditches, so that the Romans had a troublesome and perplexing journey of it. And some were who, supposing by these windings and turnings of Andromachus that no good was intended, resolved to follow him no further. And at last Cassius himself returned to Carha, and his guides, the Arabians, advising him to tarry there till the moon was got out of Scorpio, he told them that he was most afraid of Sagittarius, and so, with 500 horse, went off to Syria. You know, the death card of the tarot and the art card of the tarot. Scorpio and Sagittarius. But now people are like, well, the age of Aries. It's not the age of Aries. I think most people are looking at the age of Aries instead of the age of Aquarius. And, well, people look at the, where constellations are thought to have different stars, but really, okay, if Leo over here. So it's the age of Aquarius, so people are looking at the wrong star sign when they're making this stuff in the first place, so it's further proof that it's faith-based reactions upon people, right? Others there were who, having got honest guides, not, ooh, I don't like this sign over here in the sky that has nothing to do with this, took their way by the mountains, called Sinaca, and got into places of security by daybreak. These were 5,000 under the command of Octavius, a very gallant man, but Crassus fared worse. Day overtook him, and still deceived by Andromachus, and entangled in the fens and the difficult country. There were with him 4 cohorts of legionary soldiers, a very few horsemen, and 5 lictors, with whom, having with great difficulty got into the way, and not being a mile and a half from Octavius, instead of going to join him, although the enemy were already upon him, he retreated to another hill, neither so defensible nor impassable for the horse, but lying under the hills at Sinaca, and continued so as to join them in a long ridge through the plain. Octavius could see in what danger the general was, and himself at first but slenderly followed, hurried to the rescue. Soon after the rest, upbraiding one another with baseness in forsaking their officers, marched down and falling upon the Parthians, drove them from the hill, and compassing Crassus about, and fencing him with their shields, declared proudly that no arrow in Parthia should ever touch their general, so long as there was a man of them left alive to protect him. Surenna, therefore, perceiving his soldiers less inclined to expose themselves, and knowing that if the Romans should prolong the battle till night, they might then gain the mountains and be out of his reach, betook himself to his usual craft. Some of the prisoners were set free, who had, as it was contrived, being in hearing, while some of the barbarians spoke a set purpose in the camp to the effect that the king did not design the war to be pursued to extremity against the Romans, but rather desired, by his general treatment of Crassus, to make a step towards reconciliation. And the barbarians desisted from fighting, and Surenna himself, with his chief officers, riding gently to the hill, unbent his bow, and held out his hand, inviting Crassus to an agreement, and saying that it was beside the king's intentions that they had thus had experience of the courage and the strength of his soldiers, and now he desired no other contention but that of kindness and friendship, by making a truce and permitting them to go away in safety. These words of Surenna the rest received joyfully, and were eager to accept the offer, but Crassus, who had sufficient experience of their perfidiousness, and was unable to see any reason for the sudden change, would give no ear to them, and only took time to consider. But the soldiers cried out and advised him to treat, and then went to upbraid and affront him, saying that it was very unreasonable that he should bring them to fight with such men armed, whom himself, without their arms, durst not look in the face. He tried first to prevail with them by entreaties, and told them that if they would have patience till evening, they might get into the mountains and passes inaccessible for horse, and be out of danger. And withal he pointed out the way with his hand, entreating them not to abandon their preservation, now close before them, but when they mutinied and clashed their targets in a threatening manner, he was overpowered and forced to go, and only turning about in parting, said, "You, Octavius, and Petronius, and the rest of the officers who are present, see the necessity of going which I lie under, and cannot be but sensible of the indignities and violence offered to me. Tell all men, when you have escaped, that Crassus perished rather by the subtlety of his enemies than by the disobedience of his countrymen." One of the things, going a little bit back, astrology is saying stuff with, the stuff in the heavens, right? And like all symbology, the stars and stuff and planets and, well, that being the stuff, right? The sage directs the oracle. So don't let some random group of symbols or somebody that can, control you, control the symbolism yourself.